Belgium, December 1944. The Ardennes forest stretched across the landscape like a frozen nightmare, its snow-laden branches creating a canopy of white silence that masked the thunder building beneath. Private James Rourke presses back against the rough wooden wall of a cattle shed on the outskirts of a village whose name he could never properly pronounce, watching frost crystals form on the metal of his Springfield rifle. The shed smelled of old hay and animal warmth long departed, its Belgian owners having fled weeks earlier when the first American units arrived. Now it belonged to the war, another structure commandeered for tactical purposes, another piece of civilian life absorbed into military necessity. Outside, the temperature hovered just below freezing, that bitter cold that settled into bones and made every movement an exercise in discomfort. But Rourke wasn't thinking about the cold. He was thinking about the 17 American snipers who died in the past month, killed by German counter-snipers who'd learned to predict exactly where U.S. marksmen would position themselves. Rourke had watched 3 of those deaths personally, had seen good men, soldiers who'd survived Normandy and the push across France, get their heads blown off because they did exactly what the manual told them to do. Army doctrine was clear about sniper positioning. Find elevated positions with good sight lines, establish firing ports at chest or eye level for optimal stability, create concealment that allowed comfortable prone or kneeling positions. Every sniper in the European theater had been trained on these principles, had practiced them until they became instinct. And the Germans, veteran soldiers who'd been fighting since Poland and France, had learned to anticipate these standard positions with lethal accuracy. They watched for the obvious spots: upper floor windows, hay loft openings, elevated hides and tree lines. Their counter-snipers, equipped with excellent optics and years of combat experience, systematically eliminated American marksmen who followed doctrine too predictably. James Rourke had grown up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, spending his childhood in barns and sheds that looked remarkably similar to this Belgian cattle shelter. He understood these structures in a way that soldiers from cities or suburbs never could, knew their dimensions and sight angles and structural weaknesses without conscious thought. More importantly, he understood how animals use space, how cattle positioned themselves low to ground, how barn cats hunted from unexpected angles, how predators exploited positions that prey animals never thought to watch. That farm-bred instinct, combined with 3 months of watching American snipers die in predictable positions, had given Rourke an idea that violated every principle of conventional marksmanship doctrine. For the past 2 days, while his squad was out on patrol rotations, Rourke had been secretly modifying the cattle shed's wooden wall. Using his trench knife and working with careful patience, he'd carved a firing slit approximately 4 inches wide and 2 inches tall, positioned exactly 8 inches above the dirt floor. It was an absurdly low position, requiring a shooter to lie completely flat on their stomach with their face pressed against the cold ground, aiming from an angle that made conventional shooting posture impossible. No sniper manual recommended such positioning. The angle was terrible for stability, the posture uncomfortable for extended periods, the sight picture compromised by the extreme low profile. Every instructor at sniper school would have failed a student who suggested this approach. But Rourke wasn't thinking about sniper school. He was thinking about the fundamental problem that was killing his fellow marksmen: predictability. German soldiers had learned to skin elevated positions, to watch for the telltale shadows of rifle barrels protruding from chest-height openings, to anticipate where American doctrine would place snipers. They'd turned the U.S. Army's own training manual into a targeting guide, using American predictability as a tactical advantage. What they weren't watching, what no military doctrine on either side emphasized, was ground level. Soldiers looked forward and upward, instinctively scanning for threats at or above their own sight level. The psychological bias was universal. Danger came from positions that offered the shooter advantage. An advantage meant elevation and comfortable firing posture. Nobody expected a sniper to be lying in the dirt like a snake, shooting from an ankle-height slit that shouldn't provide any tactical benefit. Rourke had tested his modified position yesterday evening, lying prone behind his improvised firing port and checking the sight angles. The view was limited, covering only about 40 degrees of lateral arc, and the prone position made rapid target acquisition difficult. But what the position lacked in conventional advantages, it offered in pure concealment. From outside, the 8-inch high slit was virtually invisible positioned where shadows pooled and where no observer would think to look for a threat. More importantly, the extreme low angle created an optical illusion. Anyone looking at the shed would see an intact wall, their eyes passing over the tiny opening without registering it as significant. The human brain filtered out small ground-level details, focusing instead on more obvious potential threats. The real challenge was the shooting mechanics. Conventional rifle marksmanship relied on specific body positions that distributed weight, controlled breathing, and stabilized the weapon through bone structure and muscle tension. Rohr's cattle shed position violated all of these principles. Lying completely flat with a rifle extended forward required unconventional muscle engagement, making breath control harder and introducing tremor patterns that standard training didn't address. The sight picture through the scope was compromised by the acute upward angle, requiring holdover calculations that differed from normal engagement geometry. Rohr had spent hours working through these problems, adjusting his body position incrementally, teaching his muscles to stabilize the rifle through methods no instructor had ever mentioned. His squad leader, Sergeant Bill Kowalski, had discovered Rohr's modification yesterday afternoon and immediately ordered him to stop. The confrontation had been tense but brief. Kowalski was a by-the-book non-com who'd come up through the ranks by following regulations precisely, and the idea of a private unilaterally modifying tactical positions without authorization violated his fundamental understanding of military order. More practically, Kowalski pointed out that Rohr had damaged civilian property, something the Army took seriously in occupied friendly territory. The Belgians were allies, their cooperation essential for intelligence and logistics, and destroying their buildings, even in pursuit of tactical advantage, created diplomatic complications that privates weren't authorized to create. Rohr had listened to Kowalski's reprimand with the patient silence of someone who'd already decided to ignore it, then quietly asked the sergeant how many more snipers needed to die before someone tried something different. The question hung in the cold air of the cattle shed, unanswerable and uncomfortable. Kowalski had glared at Rohr for a long moment, then told him to fill in the firing slit and return the wall to its original condition. But the sergeant hadn't actually watched Rohr comply, had simply walked away trusting that his order would be followed. Rohr had made a show of gathering tools and materials, then done absolutely nothing to repair the modification. The firing slit remained, a ragged rectangular opening 8 inches above the dirt floor, waiting for a moment when theory would meet combat reality. That moment arrived on the morning of December 18th, when German forces launched the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Rohr's unit, positioned in what had been a quiet sector, suddenly found itself facing a major enemy advance. At 0547 hours, artillery began falling on American positions with an intensity that suggested something far larger than routine harassment fire. Rohr was on watch in the cattle shed when the barrage started, had enough warning to take cover behind the structure's thick wooden supports before the shells started landing close enough to shower him with frozen dirt and shrapnel fragments. The artillery preparation lasted 23 minutes, a systematic pounding designed to suppress defensive positions and create shock that would slow American response. When it lifted at 0610 hours, Rohr immediately moved to his modified firing position, sliding into the prone posture behind his ankle-height slit. Through his scope, magnified in the gray dawn light, he could see German infantry advancing across the snow-covered field approximately 400 yards distant. They moved in tactical formation, using terrain features for cover, their white winter camouflage making them difficult to distinguish against the landscape. These weren't green troops. Their movement patterns showed the discipline of veteran soldiers who understood how to minimize exposure while maintaining offensive momentum. Rohr controlled his breathing, fighting the adrenaline surge that came with contact, and began his target assessment. The German formation included at least 30 soldiers that he could see, likely more behind the initial wave. Standard sniper doctrine in this situation would be to engage the most tactically significant targets first. Squad leaders, radio operators, soldiers carrying specialized weapons. But Rohr faced a different calculation. His position was perfect for concealment, but limited in field of fire. Once he took his first shot, the Germans would know approximately where the fire originated and would respond accordingly. His survival depended on exploiting the critical seconds before enemy soldiers processed what was happening and identified his position. His first shot came at 0614 hours. targeting a German soldier who'd paused in the open to signal others forward. The Springfield's report cracked across the frozen landscape, sharp and definitive. 400 yards away, the German soldier dropped instantly, killed before he heard the shot that took him. For perhaps 3 seconds, nothing happened. The advancing Germans continued their movement, unaware that one of their number had fallen. The crack of rifle fire not yet processed as immediate threat. Then the formation reacted, soldiers dropping into cover positions, scanning the tree line and structures for the source of hostile fire. But they were scanning wrong. The German soldiers, trained by years of combat experience, looked toward elevated positions, toward the second floor of the farmhouse to Rohr's left, toward the hay loft of the barn to his right, toward the tree line that offered conventional sniper hides. Their eyes passed over the cattle shed as a structure too low and too exposed to shelter a marksman. That cognitive blind spot, that assumption about where threats should originate, gave Rohr the time he needed. His second shot, fired 8 seconds after the first, dropped another German who'd taken cover behind a slight rise in the terrain. The soldier had thought himself concealed, but Rohr's extreme low angle gave him a sight line beneath cover that would have blocked shots from elevated positions. The bullet caught the German in the upper chest, and he fell backward, clearly hit, but his status uncertain from Rohr's distance. Now the German formation knew they were under fire, but they still couldn't identify the source. Rohr watched through a scope as enemy soldiers pointed in different directions, arguing about where the shooting originated. Some gestured toward the farmhouse, others toward the tree line. Nobody pointed at the cattle shed, at the ground-level slit that shouldn't exist, at the position that violated every assumption about sniper doctrine. Rohr's third, fourth, and fifth shots came in rapid succession, exploiting confusion and the unique angles his position provided. Each shot targeted a German soldier who thought he'd found adequate cover, who'd positioned himself behind terrain features that blocked conventional fire lanes, but left him exposed to ground-level observation. The Germans were dying without understanding why, their tactical assumptions betrayed by an innovation nobody had prepared them for. At 0617 hours, 3 minutes after his first shot, a German machine gun team attempted to establish a support position behind a low stone wall approximately 350 yards from Rohr's location. The team worked with practiced efficiency, setting up their MG-42 with speed that spoke to extensive training. Conventional sniper doctrine would make this target difficult. The stone wall provided excellent cover from elevated positions, and the machine gun team stayed low as they worked. But from Rohr's angle, lying flat on the dirt floor of a cattle shed, he could see the upper bodies of both crew members as they positioned their weapon. His sixth and seventh shots, fired within 4 seconds of each other, eliminated both soldiers before the machine gun ever fired a round. The German advance stalled. Rohr could see confusion spreading to their formation, soldiers hesitating instead of pressing forward, taking cover that should protect them, yet watching their numbers diminish from an invisible threat. An officer, identifiable by his command posture and the way other soldiers oriented toward him, began shouting orders, gesturing emphatically toward various positions. Rohr centered his crosshairs on the German officer, compensating for wind and the slight upward angle his position required, and fired his 8th shot. The officer dropped mid-gesture, command structure suddenly decapitated at a critical moment. The advancing German force, now leaderless and under fire from a source they couldn't identify, began a tactical withdrawal. Soldiers who'd been pressing forward started pulling back to more secure positions, their offensive momentum broken by casualties they couldn't explain or counter. Rohr's 9th and final shot of the engagement targeted a German soldier who was attempting to drag a wounded comrade to safety, an act of battlefield compassion that tactical necessity forced Rohr to exploit. The shot connected, and both soldiers went down in a tangle of limbs and equipment. Then, for reasons Rohr couldn't determine, the surviving Germans broke contact entirely, withdrawing across the field they'd attempted to cross, leaving their casualties where they fell. The engagement had lasted 6 minutes from first shot to enemy withdrawal, 9 confirmed kills or critical wounds, and the German advance in this sector had been blunted before it could gain momentum. Rohr remained in position for another 20 minutes, watching for renewed enemy movement, but the field stayed empty except for fallen German soldiers. His mouth was dry, his heart still racing with combat adrenaline, His body ached from the awkward prone position he'd maintained. But he was alive, undetected, and had achieved what conventional sniper doctrine said shouldn't be possible. Multiple kills from a position that offered no elevated advantage, no comfortable shooting posture, nothing but pure concealment, and an angle nobody thought to watch. When Sergeant Kowalski arrived at the cattle shed 15 minutes later, having heard the engagement from his position in the village, he found Rourke still prone behind his illegal firing slit, scope trained on the now quiet field. The sergeant stared at the 9 German bodies visible in the snow, then at Rohr's ground-level position, then back at the casualties. His face went through several expressions: anger at the disobeyed order, confusion about how Rourke had survived, grudging recognition that the unorthodox method had worked. Finally, without a word, Kowalski knelt down beside Rourke and studied the sight angles the modified position provided. "You can see under their cover," Kowalski said slowly, understanding dawning. "From down here, you're shooting at angles that bypass conventional protection." He was quiet for a long moment, processing implications. "How many did you drop?" 9 confirmed hits, Rourke replied, his voice hoarse from tension and cold. "Don't know how many were kills versus wounds, but they're all down. Machine gun team, officer, squad members. Stop the advance cold, at least in this sector." Kowalski nodded slowly, his tactical mind working through what this meant for the broader defensive situation. The German offensive was massive, overwhelming in its scope and intensity, but it could only succeed through thousands of small unit actions like the advance Rourke had just stopped. If one private with an unconventional firing position could blunt an entire assault element, what could a systematic application of the technique accomplish across the defensive line? "I'm going to catch hell for not stopping you," Kowalski said finally. "But right now, we need every advantage we can get. Show me exactly how you set this up, what angles work, what the limitations are. And do it fast, because I need to get word to the other sniper teams before the Germans try again." Over the next hour, while the battle raged across the Ardennes, Rourke gave Kowalski a detailed briefing on his cattle shed modification. He explained the sight angle calculations, the body position requirements, the optical illusion that made the firing slit effectively invisible from normal observation distances. He demonstrated the prone shooting technique he developed, show how to stabilize a rifle without conventional bone support, explain the breathing control modifications necessary for accurate fire from such an awkward position. Kowalski absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone who understood he was learning something that could save lives, that might shift tactical balance in a desperate defensive battle. By noon, 3 other sniper teams in the regiment had implemented variations of Rohr's technique, modifying structures in their defensive sectors to create ankle-height firing positions. By evening, the innovation had spread to adjacent units, passed along through the informal network that connected combat soldiers more effectively than official channels. Within 2 days, American snipers across the Ardennes were creating ground-level firing positions that German doctrine had no framework for detecting or countering. The psychological impact on German infantry was significant. Soldiers found themselves under effective sniper fire from directions that shouldn't be possible, dying from angles that tactical training said were safe. The invisible threat degraded offensive momentum, made soldiers hesitant to advance, even when standard doctrine set positions were secure. German intelligence initially attributed these casualties to new American weapons technology, perhaps advanced optics that could see through conventional cover, or perhaps thermal detection systems that allowed targeting of concealed positions. Some reports theorized that American forces had deployed specialized ammunition that could penetrate terrain features previously considered protective. The truth, that U.S. snipers were simply lying on the ground and shooting from ankle height, was so tactically unconventional that German commanders dismissed it when their own snipers finally identified what was happening. A report from a German counter-sniper unit, filed in late December and later recovered by Allied intelligence, described the American technique as tactically unsound and unsustainable for trained marksmen, noting that the extreme low position violated fundamental shooting mechanics. The report recommended against developing countermeasures, predicting that American forces would abandon the technique once its limitations became apparent. That assessment proved disastrously wrong. Rourke continued using his cattle shed position throughout the battle, racking up additional confirmed kills over following weeks. He became increasingly proficient with the awkward shooting mechanics, developing muscle memory that compensated for positions' unconventional demands. Other snipers who adopted the technique compared notes, sharing refinements and modifications. Some found that certain soil types worked better than others for the prone position. Some discovered that adding minimal padding beneath elbows improved stability without significantly raising the shooting angle. Others experimented with different slit dimensions, finding optimal compromises between field of view and concealment. The innovation evolved through practical combat application, each engagement teaching lessons that spread through the informal knowledge network connecting American marksmen across the theater. The innovation spread wasn't universally welcomed. Army brass, learning about the technique through after-action reports, had mixed reactions. Some officers recognized tactical brilliance, understanding that Rohr's method addressed a specific vulnerability in established doctrine. Others saw indiscipline, worried that allowing soldiers to unilaterally modify defensive positions would undermine command authority and create accountability problems. The fact that Rohr had damaged civilian property without authorization became a point of particular contention. Belgian authorities, informed of the modifications to farm structures, filed formal complaints about property destruction. The complaints were minor in the context of a major offensive battle, but they created bureaucratic complications that some officers found easier to address by criticizing the innovation itself rather than defending its tactical value. In early January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge reached its conclusion with German forces pushed back to their starting positions, Rohr received orders to report to division headquarters for an official inquiry. The investigation wasn't exactly disciplinary. Nobody could deny that his technique had proven effective, but it wasn't celebratory either. Officers questioned him about his decision-making process, why he disobeyed direct orders to restore the cattle shed wall, whether he understood the diplomatic implications of destroying Allied property. The inquiry had the uncomfortable quality of command structure trying to fit an irregular innovation into standard regulatory framework, attempting to determine whether Rohr should be commended or reprimanded for actions that had saved lives while violating protocol. Rohr answered questions with patient honesty, explaining his reasoning without trying to justify or apologize. He'd seen a problem, American snipers dying predictably, and developed a solution based on unconventional thinking. He'd understood that his modification violated orders and damaged property, but he judged that cost acceptable given the tactical benefit. When asked if he'd make the same decision again, Rohr said yes without hesitation. When asked if he expected other soldiers to follow his example of ignoring orders they disagreed with, Rohr pointed out that's exactly what every soldier already did whenever circumstances made doctrine inadequate. The honesty didn't endear him to the inquiry board. The official outcome was bureaucratically perfect. Rohr received a commendation for tactical innovation and battlefield effectiveness, paired with a reprimand for destruction of civilian property and failure to follow direct orders. The contradictory judgment satisfied everyone and no one, allowing command to acknowledge the technique's value while maintaining that proper channels should have been followed. The Belgian farmer who owned the cattle shed received modest compensation for damages from Army funds. Sergeant Kowalski received no official sanction for failing to ensure his order was followed, though his personnel file noted supervisory concerns requiring attention. Everyone moved forward with the uncomfortable awareness that military innovation often happened despite regulations rather than through them. But the real outcome wasn't in official reports or personnel files. The real outcome was in the tactical manuals that began circulating in early 1945, in the training updates distributed to sniper schools, in the field modifications that became standard practice. The cattle shed technique, stripped of its specific origin story and translated into doctrinal language, became part of American sniper methodology. Training materials describe ground-level firing positions as valuable options for specific tactical situations, particularly when facing enemy forces trained to counter elevated positions. The technique's limitations were honestly assessed: restricted field of fire, uncomfortable sustained positioning, difficulty with rapid target acquisition. But its advantages in certain circumstances were officially recognized. Rohr's name appeared nowhere in these materials. The innovation became generic, attributed to combat experience in the European theater rather than to any specific soldier. That anonymity was partly intentional. Doctrine wasn't supposed to be about individual heroes, but about reproducible techniques that any trained soldier could employ. But it was also partly the result of the uncomfortable bureaucratic reality that the innovation had emerged from insubordination and property damage, circumstances that command preferred not to highlight in training materials meant to reinforce proper military order. After the war, Rohr returned to Wisconsin and his family's dairy farm, slipping back into civilian life with the same quiet competence that had characterized his military service. He never spoke much about the cattle shed technique, treating it as a practical solution to a specific problem rather than anything worthy of attention. When occasionally asked about his war service by neighbors or family, he described it in general terms, mentioning the cold and the fear and the satisfaction of returning alive. The 9 Germans he'd killed in 6 minutes, the tactical innovation that spread across the army, the inquiry that praised and reprimanded him simultaneously, all of it remained private history. Stories he kept to himself. Decades later, military historians researching the evolution of American sniper doctrine in World War II discovered references to the ground-level firing position technique in archived training manuals. Tracing its origin led to after-action reports from the Ardennes, to mention of modified cattle sheds and unconventional positioning. Eventually, through careful cross-referencing of unit records and inquiry documents, researchers identified James Rourke as the technique's originator. They attempted to contact him for interviews, wanted to document the innovation's development for a historical record. By then, Rohr was in his 70s, living alone on the Wisconsin farm where he'd grown up, still working the land with the same patient attention to detail that had once helped him recognize tactical patterns others missed. The historians who visited found him polite, but uninterested in discussing his wartime innovation at length. He confirmed the basic facts. Yes, he'd modified the cattle shed. Yes, he'd stopped a German advance using the low-angle position. Yes, the technique had spread to other units. But he deflected questions about his decision-making process, about how he developed the idea, about what he felt during that 6-minute engagement. The historians left with verified facts but little narrative color, understanding that some soldiers simply didn't care to relive their war experiences for posterity's benefit. What Rohr did tell them, in a moment of uncharacteristic reflection as they were preparing to leave, was that he'd always found odd how much attention people gave to dramatic innovations when most of warfare was about small, practical adjustments. The cattle shed technique hadn't been brilliant strategy or revolutionary tactics. It had just been noticing that everyone looked one direction and shooting from another. Farm work had taught him that animals survive by exploiting predator blind spots, by being where danger didn't think to look. The same principle applied to combat. Survival came from recognizing patterns and finding their exceptions, from being willing to try something uncomfortable if it increased your odds of living through the day. That was all the technique had ever been, a practical solution to the problem of not getting killed. The historians thanked him and drove away, leaving Rohr his farm work and his private memories. Their eventual publication on World War II sniper innovations included a section on the ground-level firing position technique, properly crediting Rohr as its developer. The work had limited circulation, read primarily by military professionals and academic specialists rather than general audiences. Rohr's name entered the historical record in footnotes and specialist texts, recognized by those who studied tactical evolution, but unknown to broader public consciousness. Modern American sniper training, building on decades of accumulated doctrine, includes instruction on unconventional firing positions for specific tactical situations. Instructors teach ground-level techniques without knowing the technique's origin, treating it as established methodology rather than someone's innovation. The cattle shed has long since been demolished or rebuilt. The wooden wall with its ankle-height firing slit loss of time and post-war reconstruction. The Belgian field where 9 German soldiers fell in 6 minutes has returned to agricultural use, growing crops in soil that once absorbed combat violence. No marker commemorates what happened there. No monument explains how one American soldier's disobedience and tactical creativity temporarily shifted advantage in a desperate defensive battle. James Rourke died in 1998, shortly after his 80th birthday, having lived a life that would appear unremarkable to anyone who didn't know to look beneath its surface. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in general terms, noting that he fought in the Battle of the Bulge and earned commendations for bravery. The cattle shed technique wasn't mentioned. The obituary writer didn't know about it, and Rohr's family, while aware he'd done something significant during the war, had never learned the details. He was buried in the town cemetery where generations of his family rested, his grave marker noting his birth and death dates. His service branch and theater, nothing more elaborate than thousands of other veteran headstones across the country. But the technique survives, evolving through successive generations of military training and combat experience. Snipers in Iraq and Afghanistan, facing enemies who'd learned to counter conventional American positioning, rediscovered the value of extreme low-angle firing positions. Modern doctrine developed sophisticated variations, incorporating lessons from urban combat and desert warfare that Rohr never encountered. Technology changed, optics improved, materials advanced, communication equipment transformed tactical coordination, but the fundamental principle Rohr recognized in a Belgian cattle shed remained valid. Enemies adapted to counter visible threats, developing countermeasures for predictable tactics, but they consistently underestimated dangers from unexpected angles, from positions that shouldn't work according to established thinking. Special operations forces, studying tactical innovation and adaptive thinking, sometimes use the cattle shed technique as a teaching case. Instructors explain how an individual soldier identified a pattern in enemy behavior, developed an unconventional solution despite lack of authority or official support, and created lasting impact through persistence and practical demonstration. The case illustrates principles that extend beyond specific techniques. The importance of questioning assumptions, the value of drawing insights from non-military experience, the reality that innovation often emerges from necessity rather than formal research. Students learn that tactical advantage frequently comes from recognizing what everyone else overlooks, from being willing to be uncomfortable if discomfort increases effectiveness. The irony that Rohr was both commended and reprimanded, that his innovation was adopted while his insubordination was criticized, captures something essential about military organizations and innovation generally. Institutions need stability and predictability, need soldiers to follow orders and respect authority, need regulations that maintain organizational coherence. But institutions also need adaptation and creativity, need soldiers who can recognize when doctrine fails reality, need innovations that address problems faster than official channels can respond. These requirements exist in constant tension, never fully reconcilable, managed through the kind of bureaucratic compromise that gave Rohr simultaneous praise and censure. The cattle shed sniper Slit represents a particular category of military innovation, the individual soldier solution that spreads through informal networks before official doctrine catches up. Military history is full of such innovations, small tactical adjustments that accumulate into significant advantages but rarely receive attention proportional to their impact. The soldiers who develop these techniques usually remain anonymous, their contributions absorbed into institutional knowledge without attribution, their names forgotten while their methods endure. Recognition, when it comes, arrives decades later through historical research rather than contemporary acknowledgement, by which point the innovators have often passed beyond caring about credit or validation. For James Rourke, that anonymity seems to have been acceptable, perhaps even preferred. He'd solved a problem that needed solving, had helped other soldiers survive a desperate battle, had contributed something practical to the chaotic violence that was the Battle of the Bulge. That accomplishment, personal and immediate, mattered more than historical recognition or doctrinal credit. He'd acted based on observation and necessity, had trusted his judgment when authority disagreed, had been proven correct by outcomes that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That validation, the 9 German soldiers who fell in 6 minutes, the lives saved by a technique that spread through combat necessity rather than official channels, was sufficient recognition for someone who'd never sought attention in the first place. The cattle shed technique endures not because of Rohr's name, but because of its practical effectiveness, because soldiers facing similar problems continue to find similar solutions, because the principle of exploiting cognitive blind spots remains tactically relevant regardless of era or technology. In that sense, Rohr achieved something more lasting than personal recognition. He contributed a permanent addition to the accumulated knowledge that helped soldiers survive combat. His insight, translated into doctrine and transmitted through training, continues protecting lives decades after his death, anonymously persistent in the way that most meaningful military innovations actually function. Walking the Wisconsin farm where Rohr spent his final years, where he'd grown up and returned to after war, the connection between his civilian life and his tactical innovation becomes clear. The same patient observation that helped him understand cattle behavior and crop cycles had helped him recognize patterns in enemy movement and tactical positioning. The same willingness to try unconventional methods when standard approaches failed had characterized both his farming and his combat service. The same quiet competence that made him an effective farmer made him an effective soldier. Proof that military excellence could emerge from unexpected backgrounds, that the skills valuable in civilian life often translated to combat effectiveness in ways no training manual predicted. James Rourke never sought to be remembered for creating the cattle shed sniper slit, but his innovation remains, teaching new generations of soldiers that survival sometimes requires ignoring the rules about where threats should come from and simply being where the enemy doesn't think to look.